introduction. If anyone has any problems with hearing or seeing anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. So first, again, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm not entirely sure of the audience, so I'm going to try to be as comprehensive as possible. So sorry for any redundant or basic information, but I wanted, the goal of my conversation today, and as we talked in preparation for this, was really to give a sense of the OECD's conceptualization of the link between open government and the SDGs. And our focus, my focus, has really been on open government. And as was mentioned, we have a chapter in our review, our global report that came out last year on SDGs. We have some data to look into this, and I'll go through that, and also the Indonesia Open Government Review. So again, I'm not including a ton of examples, though there are some. You all are, I'm sure, the experts in the field, but really just I wanted to give a sense of the conceptualization of that link between open government and the SDGs. So first, starting off, very basically, the OECD defines open government as a culture of governance based on innovation, on innovative and sustainable public policies and practices inspired by the principles of transparency, accountability, and participation that fosters democracy and inclusive growth. And I put in bold those three principles of transparency, accountability, and participation because we, in looking at the link between open government and the SDGs, have seen that that is an effective way to look into how the two processes are linked. And so what we're looking at is how these three principles of transparency, accountability, and participation can support the SDGs and vice versa, and we'll go into that in a bit. So broadly, why link the SDGs and open government? And one of the key elements is that by looking at the SDGs, we see that there are elements that open government initiatives and principles can support. And that's particularly important given the complexity of the SDGs. There are 17 goals and 169 targets that cover a wide range of topics. And because it's such a wide range of topics, the SDGs will really help support countries' parties for public governance reform and their national strategies moving forward. And so open government, we think, has a role to play and should be part of that conversation. It's also important to note that the SDGs will require a country-specific response in the sense that countries will set their own national targets according to their circumstances. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all necessarily. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach in the sense that in order for countries to make the SDGs relevant for them, they need to make sure that citizens are engaged in the process, and that's where we're coming out. That's a real key component of what we're looking at here. And then finally, the SDGs are aimed to be transformational in the sense that they will require mobilization of a wide range of stakeholders, and they're designed that way on purpose. And so to not include open government principles or to not think about how open government can support the SDGs is really missing a key element of what the SDGs are all about. So that's some quick background. As I noted, the OECD has mainstreamed basically SDGs in two of our reports. The first was the Open Government, the Global Context and the Way Forward, which is based on a 2015 survey on open government and citizen participation in the policy cycle, which gathered information from 53 countries, and I'll present some of that information here. And it also provides, we call it an in-depth evidence-based analysis of open government initiatives and challenges countries face. And as part of that, we have included a section on the SDGs, and that chapter is a lot of what this presentation will be covering. And then again, the OECD Indonesia Open Government Review, which is one that I helped lead, and so I'd be happy to talk about it in more detail. That was the first review that has a chapter specifically on the link between open government and the SDGs, and that was at the request of the government of Indonesia. Both these topics are relevant to them, and they're active, or they're encouraging us, and really excited that we were able to include this in the review, which we were happy to do. So broadly, our thinking about our conceptualization of how open government and the SDGs work together are that through open government strategies and practices, open government will support both the substance of the SDG implementation, and I mean substance in terms of specific goals and targets, and then also in the process of the SDG implementation. And that's a more vague approach, but the idea is how to include citizens and CSOs throughout the entire policy cycle of the SDGs, and I'll go into both of those. But by focusing on both, by thinking about how open government policies and principles and initiatives can support the substance of SDG implementation, and directly contributing to the achievement of the goals and the process of the SDG, the policy cycle of the implementation, they will both lead to mutual reinforcement of open government principles and the SDGs. So they ideally, moving forward with open government will support the SDGs, and moving forward the SDGs will support open government initiatives. And we really believe that can be the case. I should note that the OECD is obviously not the only organization thinking along these lines, and specifically the Open Government Partnership has a joint declaration on open government for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, which is very, matches well, and it's along the lines of what we're talking about, which calls for the endorsing countries to encourage transparent, accountable, participatory, and technology-enabled implementation of the SDGs, and commit signatories to use the OGP National Action Plan to adopt commitments that serve to promote implementation of the SDGs. And that's an interesting, and I have the link here, but that's an interesting and a practical way we think that that open government activities can support the implementation of the SDGs. So moving into the substance, the first pillar of what I was talking about, how open government can support the substance of the implementation of the SDGs, there are three specific targets that are particularly relevant to open government. The first is target 16.6, which calls for developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. It's also target 16.7, which is all under goal 16, to ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. And then target 16.10, which calls for countries to ensure public access to information and to protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. And again, these are the ones that are most directly relevant for open government work, but we'll get into some of the others later. Now, what we've found on some of our analysis, and this is based off of country responses to the OECD survey on open government, which was conducted in 2015 and which was compiled and put together for the 2016 global report. What we found was that many governments, both in the OECD and then outside the OECD, now in the survey looked at 52 countries, there's 35 OECD members, and then we looked at a number of others from Latin America, the MENA region, and Southeast Asia. And what we found was that many governments are already moving forward with implementing Goal 16 via their open government activities and initiatives. So it's not to say that the SDGs is something parallel and removed from open government. These two initiatives, as we can see from the data, really overlap and or support each other. So for example, one of the primary objective that countries aim to achieve through open government initiatives is to improve the transparency of the public sector. And as you can see, 86% of OECD countries and 88% of all of the country respondents said that this is a key objective to promote their open government initiatives, which links directly to the targets that we just talked about. There's also a key objective for open government work is improving the accountability of the public sector. It's also improving the effectiveness of the public sector, improving the responsiveness of the public sector to citizens' needs and businesses, and improving citizen participation in policymaking. And these elements, again, go directly back to the target 16.6, 16.7, and 16.10 that I just talked about, and all of these words I had highlighted, and they also showed up in our open government survey, when I think that really highlights the extent to which these initiatives support each other. So going into the three principles, by looking at how the idea that we had in the report and that I'm discussing today is that by looking at how countries are implementing open government activities through the lens of these principles, we can see how such initiatives support open government or support government's efforts to implement the SDGs. And so again, accountability is the principle that open and inclusive policymaking expands citizen influence on decisions, helps to prevent countries from concealing activities, and it helps ensure policies reflect public needs and that governments use resources appropriately. So this is all very straightforward, but and they clearly link to the targets under Goal 16 that I talked about. But beyond Goal 16, what we see is that there are a number of other targets and even goals where accountability and open government initiatives to support accountability specifically support these other targets. So for example, Goal 9, the entire Goal 9 is on infrastructure and innovation. And the relevance to applying open government principles to prioritize infrastructure projects is clear in the sense of overseeing procurement that responds to public needs, making sure that citizens can help prevent corruption by increasing transparency and accountability. These are elements under the entire Goal 16 of infrastructure and innovation where open government, especially through the lens of accountability, has a lot to offer. Also target 1.4, which promotes equal rights to economic resources and basic services. Target 1B, which focuses on sound policy frameworks for poverty eradication, and Target 4.5, which ensures equal access to education. And now none of these are groundbreaking. There are a number of others as you look through. I'm sure that would be relevant as well. But the key that we are identifying here is that open government can help lead to accountability for the provision of these services. And so as you look through the SDGs, goals, and targets, there are a number of places where accountability and accountability mechanisms and citizen engagement can be specifically related to promoting accountability. Now, some of the examples that we've seen, and again, these are examples that countries are already doing, but by looking at it, saying you can apply these activities to support the SDGs, not on its own, not open government for the sake of open government, but open government initiatives and principles and activities for the sake of supporting national strategies, or in this case, the SDGs, and often they're combined. So again, open government activities that support accountability include promoting open data on procurements, again, back to Goal 9, public involvement in audits of procurement procedures and infrastructure projects, asset declaration, public consultation and development of anti-corruption policies, whistleblower protection, reporting misconduct, using citizen feedback indicators and portals, and also how digital government tools can increase transparency and accountability. And so these are just some of the examples of initiatives that countries are already implementing that can help support SDGs specifically. The next principle on transparency is obviously a cornerstone of open government, and the focus on access to public sector innovation, as well as the ability for the public to be able to use the information effectively. And then the idea of ensuring that data availability is paired with data quality, processing capacity, whistleblower protection, and freedom of the press. And this is clearly linked to target 16.10, but beyond Goal 16 and beyond what we talked about, Target 9C is one that focuses on increasing access to information and communication technology. Target 12.8 focuses on ensuring that people everywhere have information and awareness for sustainable development. And Target 17.18 focuses on increasing the availability of comparative development data. And so these are three other targets beyond Goal 16 that specifically call out the role for access to information and transparency. And then some of the initiatives, tools, and activities that can support transparency include obviously the legal framework, but also ensuring that there are effective interfaces to allow citizens access official documents, both in terms of the procedures and the portals. Internal information management, human and financial resources, ensuring there are enough to promote transparency and access to information. What we've seen in some of our reviews, for example, is that there are good laws but not good implementation, and that's, I'm sure, not an uncommon finding. And then again, partnerships with CSOs to promote dissemination of information. And so that transparency is again, like I said, the cornerstone, but by looking at that as a priority across these diverse goals, it really highlights the important role of information and data and the role that they play in ensuring effective public governance reforms. And then the other principle, the other key principle that we talk about when it comes to substance is participation. And by that we mean providing governance, but the idea is that by encouraging participation, governments can provide, or citizens can provide governments with feedback and new ideas and allow stakeholders to offer inputs to enhance policy quality, as well as improve the responsiveness, inclusiveness, and participatory nature of the public sector. And so here, similar to the graph I described above, data from the OECD survey highlights the extent to which both member and non-member countries are already broadly implementing participation activities. And so you see here we asked about whether countries are implementing citizen consultation, whether implementing citizen participation in policymaking, citizen participation in service design, and citizen participation in service delivery. And what we see is that all the countries that we talked about, that we interviewed, or that responded to the survey, at least half of them have some sort of participation element, and most of the responses are over 50%. And so clearly, you can see that there's already movement toward ensuring participation is a key element of countries' open government reforms and initiatives, and how that links to the SDGs is interesting to think about. And again, here we see a few of the specific targets where participation is key. So, for example, target 5.5 on women's participation and leadership and decision making, and target 5.5 is under the goal 5, which is focused on gender. Then target 6B is the role of communities in water and sanitation management. Target 10.2 is on social, economic, and political inclusion. Generally, target 11.3 is on participatory settlement planning and management. Target 15.C is on the community capacity for sustainable livelihood opportunities, and target 17 seeks to promote effective public, private, and citizen civil society partnerships. And again, some of the primary tools and activities include the legal policy framework, public information, priority setting, fora and dialogue opportunities, which there are a number of in Indonesia, for example, participatory budgeting, and co-production of policies and services. Now, so that's the overview of the substance. Now, in terms of supporting the process of SDG implementation, the methods, what we want to highlight here is that the methods and processes that countries use to implement open government programs are also relevant. So it's not just looking at the SDGs and saying, well, we can apply this here and that there, and kind of an ad hoc approach. Beyond that, stepping beyond the specific implementation, looking at how open government can inform the entire process is I think, also important to think about. And that's true for a number of reasons, both the extent, the breadth and interconnected nature of the SDGs, as we say here, demands both horizontal and vertical integration, so across ministries at the national level to make sure everyone's moving in the same direction, but also vertical integration or coordination to make sure that while a national government has a priority, how do you make sure that that's implemented at the subnational level? And because of that complexity, what we see is that it complicates the decision of where to assign responsibility, though it does highlight the relevance of similar open government coordination initiatives. And for example, what we found is that 85% of the respondent countries to our survey, and including 77% of OECD countries, have established an office responsible for horizontal coordination of their open government initiatives. And so that we feel highlights the potential for something similar in the SDGs, and the challenges, successes that open government coordination offices have faced would be relevant and would provide relevant lessons for SDG coordination. The example of Center of Government Coordination in Indonesia, I'll talk about briefly, is that they've created a secretariat both for open government initiatives and for SDGs. And they're both of those secretariats are charged with supporting the implementation and the mainstreaming of their various initiatives at the horizontal and the vertical level. But what's interesting is that there's shared leadership under the National Development Planning Office, and that was designed so that they can ensure linkages between the initiatives because they see this overlap. And so that's, I think, an interesting example of how governments are institutionalizing this relationship between open government and the SDGs. I would also say that the Center of Government is probably critical in developing a national implementation plan via an inclusive process. And the idea here is that the Center of Government is uniquely suited to ensure broad public buy-in for the design, monitoring, and implementation of the SDGs. It's uniquely suited to help design the strategies and also align incentives across ministries and subnational governments. And I think that's a really key point. If this is a national strategy, what are the lessons that open government can take and what can be applied to the SDGs? So that now more broadly on the process, not just the methods, but thinking about citizen engagement and the role of citizens across the policy cycle of the SDGs. So that means the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and reporting and feedback. And the key principle here, which is not certainly new to the open government world, is that by engaging citizens, CSOs in the private sector and the policy cycle, this leads to greater responsiveness and public satisfaction. And it also, by collaborating with citizens at every stage of the policy, of the planning and delivery, is key to ensuring sustainable service quality improvements. And these are some very similar ways that citizens and CSOs are engaged in promoting policy planning and design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. But thinking about this specifically through the lens of the SDGs shows the extent to which open government can inform the SDG process. As a, I think, potentially interesting specific example of this, what we've seen and what has been noted by UNDP in particular as well is that the SDGs will require an investment in statistical capacity for the monitoring and evaluation, both in terms of the amount of data, but also new types of data and reporting instruments that I think, because of the bottom-up nature and just the breadth and complexity of the SDGs, will require close coordination between governments and citizens. And so how can governments in the monitoring and evaluation part, that'll be an interesting part, I think, of this, of how governments can think about using citizens and working with citizens and CSOs more collaboratively to get the monitoring and evaluation. There's one example I wanted to go into, and I'm almost done. I think I'm sticking to the time. But there's one example that I wanted to highlight, which is from Mexico, which has linked to its national open government data portal and has a specific focus on the SDGs. And so this is an open data resource for the public to monitor and measure the country's progress on implementing the SDGs. This was launched in September 2015 with the support of UNDP and the Mexican Agency for International Development Cooperation. And I have the link on the slide there. And the portal is designed to ensure the use of open data specifically for tracking and monitoring the SDG implementation process. And like I said, this is linked to the Open Government Portal, which is managed by the Office of the President. And so the idea is that the collaborative data can be used and uploaded by citizens that involves them in this process in a way that I think it provides a really interesting example of how open government initiatives can support both the substance and the process of the SDGs. So looking ahead, what we've identified as some key elements to consider and the recommendations to consider. First are developing the links between open government reforms the design, implementation, and monitoring of the SDGs. And I've talked a lot about this, but thinking specifically how that would happen, how that would work, it would be, for example, supporting institutional collaboration between the responsible organizations. And Indonesia was a case of that, where the two secretariats have similar management, have their own structures and their own mandates, but are linked at the top to ensure coordination. Also, very practically linking open government action plans to relevant SDG goals or targets. So this is a way that highlights on the national action plans how countries' work or governments' work is supporting SDGs specifically, and it forces a certain honesty about what that approach is. And then also potentially facilitating joint monitoring of progress and results. And again, this is just I would say procedural, but the idea is that by bringing citizens in and making sure those links are developed and institutionalized, you can use open government to support the SDGs. A second key, or a second potential recommendation, is promoting the use of open data for reporting on SDG achievements. And that would be a way to support both CSOs, their role as watchdogs, but also fosters reuse of public sector information and ensures that the data is up there, is usable and effective, and gets, does what it's supposed to do. And then finally, the idea is to increase the involvement of citizens in the policy cycle of the SDGs to ensure that initiatives are inclusive and they reflect public needs. And then from our end, I would say that as we continue to develop our open government reviews and update our survey and come up with new versions of the survey, we're very conscious of focusing on looking at how open government can link to SDG implementation, because we find that as a concrete way to ensure that open government principles and initiatives link to national strategies and can be mainstreamed into national strategies. So with that, I think I'd turn it over to questions, and we'll be happy to discuss any of this further, as well as share any of the documents that I discussed today.
Thank you very much, Craig, for some very comprehensive insights and a comprehensive overview. I might just start with a question from myself. You spoke there about the accountability and then the policy process involved in the SDGs. I just have a question about what accountability measures are in place when it comes to actually monitoring the implementation of the SDGs and ensuring that countries actually do what they've signed up to do?
I think,
maybe a tricky
yeah,
question.
I mean, it is. I mean, so part of it, I don't want to cheat here. I mean, but part of that is really each country to respond for themselves, in the sense of what there doesn't necessarily need to be, in my opinion, new initiatives to the extent that you're able to promote accountability and pressure governments. That can be used for the SDGs. Now, I think Mexico is a good example, that open data portal that's supported by the center of government, but something similar like that, where you hold governments to account, saying, this is their goal, this is what they're planning to do for the SDGs. Have they done it? What does the data say that they've done? And to make it a very clear link between the policies and the data that you're able to collect is I think, a really interesting and relevant way to do that. And to the extent that you can't collect that data, or you can't support, or you can't hold governments to account, whether it's the SDGs or not, the SDGs are a window into that, or a mechanism by which you can do that. But if you can't get the data, or the governments are listening, I mean, that might symbolize a bigger problem than just related to the SDGs. So our kind of opinion on this, our take is that the SDGs provide a really concrete way to promote those initiatives, but it's not necessarily new, or it shouldn't be seen as something different than the role of accountability or transparency or and other mechanisms. But does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was maybe a question from Nicola. I don't know if Nicola is still with us.
I am.
Great.
Hi.
Hi there.
I sent the message in. I don't know if you received it or not, the actual text. Basically, thank you, Craig, for your presentation. I learnt loads this morning about the subject. So my question, obviously, as you know, the SDGs inscribe national governments as one of the key locus of realising the SDGs. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can, thank you.
Yeah. So my question was about what prospect does he see in the context of open government and its applicability for intergovernmental collaboration through, for example, regional associations. Would he see those as potentially informing strategies to realise the SDGs, and kind of what would be Craig's thinking about that? Have the OECD given any thought to this at all, this question?
That is a good question. So regional, actually, could you specify, when you say regional associations, are you thinking like the OGP, or are you thinking the role for the OECD? I just want to make sure that I understand.
Yeah. So no, I'm thinking of regional groups of government, like, for example, the European Union, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, Mercosur, SADC, the Southern African Development Community, prospectively the African Union. So, kind of forms of cross-national or intergovernmental political and other economic collaboration, which, as we know, or in relation to my research anyway, shows it has increasingly strong social policy as well as economic policy and trade policy dimensions. I
guess one thing about this is that the SDGs, in my opinion, are so, they're so broad, and they cover so many issues, and each country is coming from a different place, that I really think it's important to see the SDGs as driven, or the priorities are driven by the countries, and the way the countries decide those priorities and implement them will be influenced by citizens and CSOs. Now, that said, I think regional organizations, especially like the EU and ASEAN and Mercosur, even in the OECD, I think they would provide a really important resource for sharing best practices and highlighting the role of the SDGs as a link to the national strategies more broadly. So again, not to see the SDGs as something imposed from the outside, but to say these are cases, or this is an example, or this is how the SDGs can be brought into national strategies to be invested and owned by the countries. I don't know the extent to which it makes sense to expect the EU or ASEAN to identify which are the most important, but I do think that there's a role there to highlight this link. Now, I was in Thailand just last week, actually, and they have talked about using the SDGs to promote citizen engagement through their sufficiency economy principle. And now, I'm not sure the extent to which they'll actually do that, but that's a case where you could potentially see being highlighted by an organization like ASEAN, saying, well, this is what Thailand is doing. This is how they see the SDGs linking to their open government work, but also what they see as priorities in terms of moving forward. And so to encourage those organizations to do that, I think would be helpful, to advertise the SDGs as a way to encourage this link. But I don't see them as setting the priorities, because again, I think this is such a country-specific approach that I guess the role is somewhat limited, in my opinion, on the role of regional organizations for specific, activities.
Okay, thank you. May I just take another 10 seconds with a little follow-up question?
Yeah,
sure.
If that's okay with the advisement presenter.
Yeah,
thank you. So what you're saying, and I think this is not unreasonable, is that basically the role of regional organisations like the ones we've mentioned are mainly to amplify and to kind of visibilise national strategies. And I'm kind of thinking about that, and that's really curious and interesting, because actually one of the things that the SDG framework does do, which actually which puts it in direct distinction from the previous MDGs, is that it actually inscribes a key role for regional collectivities, regional entities in data sharing, reporting, monitoring, evaluation. So it does actually inscribe a key role for regional strategies and the kind of institutional apparatus that support that. Which kind of, led me to kind of ask that question really about, what are the prospects of, kind of embedding an open government framework, within these regional strategies, and, and whether it's more than just about amplifying national strategies, whether there might be a prospective kind of, regional collective forum in which countries can actually cooperate.
Yeah, I guess beyond, maybe it should have been clear. It's not so much just amplifying the national strategies, but to do that, they put that better than I did. But I mean to serve as a clearinghouse for both the practices and initiatives, but also to the extent that they can share data, especially when it comes to environmental issues. Obviously, there's the problems don't necessarily stop at the border. Security issues, all that. I mean, I think there are a lot of ways that regional bodies can support the implementation of the SDGs. What I think is important to highlight, though, is that the countries themselves should own the SDGs and the implementation priorities, because there's so many, and because each country is starting at a different place. What the regional bodies can do is support the regional components either through data sharing, but also through highlighting what other countries are doing to share best practices, and to identify how both the SDGs are linked with the national strategies, but also how governments are conceptualizing that link between open government and the SDGs, and to say this isn't a parallel track. This is something the open government initiatives and principles support very much, the implementation of the SDGs, but no, I mean, I think at the end of the day, too, right, the countries have to have some ownership. The extent to which the regional organizations can support that, I think would be great. But beyond anything more specific, I haven't thought about it more specifically than that, I should say.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
I'd like to just bring in actually Graham Long at this point, because he has just commented around the issue of accountability mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Graham, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I mean, there are some new mechanisms for follow-up and review associated with the SDGs, and I guess it's worth sketching those out to complement what Craig has said. So there are, so there's a new UN kind of intergovernmental level body called the High Level Political Forum, which meets every year. That reviews goals thematically in kind of clusters of 5. There are states kind of voluntarily, but on some kind of informal rota, signing up to present reviews of their national practice. And that isn't really accountability yet, but it could be. It's kind of an opportunity for it, or something that might develop into it. States are also doing things internally. So I think parliaments have a key role here, and SDGs can be used as kind of a useful tool in parliamentary accountability. Certainly in the UK context, people may or may not be aware there's been, 3 parliamentary inquiries now on aspects of the SDGs and UK government policy. That's, where SDGs in terms of providing kind of benchmarks to test government policy against have maybe proved quite helpful. I think the regional level formal accountability structures aren't there yet. There are regional bodies that provide spaces for kind of peer learning and discussion of SDG strategies. How far they develop into meaningful accountability structures, I don't know. Just to stress that, so that's an overview of some of the kind of the formal accountability mechanisms doing the rounds, or the things that could be accountability mechanisms. Something else I just wanted to stress was the overlap between open government principles and the principles that should guide all these review structures. So alongside the 17 goals, there's also a section in the goals document that details some guiding principles to cover all review structures, and they're quite closely aligned with OGP values. More concretely, there's some, I think, so I'm kind of working on some research which will be coming out in a few weeks with Together 2030, where we surveyed some people involved in these national voluntary reviews this year. And there's an overlap with OGP members. And what strikes you from the data is how limited kind of awareness of national level processes for review are. And I think there's kind of an OGP agenda there too. I'll shut up now.
No, that's very helpful to highlight. I think the comment about limited awareness is good, particularly in the sense that because there's so much potential support between these two initiatives, it makes sense to highlight that. And by linking, again, I mentioned the potential link, potentially national action plans with SDGs specifically. That's a way to build support for both initiatives in a way that's, I think, potentially supportive. Anyway, but thank you for that. I think those are, I jotted those down. Those are helpful comments about different accountability mechanisms, and I think the role of Parliament is also good. I didn't talk about that specifically, but I think that's important to raise.
Yeah, thank you for that contribution there, Graham. I wonder, would Jamie Saunders have any comments that he wants to make? I see you've made a couple of comments in the comment box. Maybe not. In that case, I was just going to put it out to the floor. Are there any other themes or areas around the SDGs that are of particular interest to any of our participants that we might look to run a potential future webinar on? Any ideas or thoughts? Okay, in that case, I just have one final question, and I suppose it relates to my last question, Craig, just about what can citizens do if their government aren't looking as if they've signed up, but they're not looking as if they're doing too much to progress any work or an action plan around the SDGs?
What can citizens do?
Yeah, is there any avenues open to citizens to try and ensure that their government's actually take an active role in progressing an SDG action plan?
Yeah, I think that's a way where the breadth of the SDGs can be your friend in a way that what I mean by that is that if the government signs up to the SDGs but isn't focused on but isn't moving forward broadly, there should be enough in the SDGs where if there's an avenue that you have or the CSOs have that is particularly responsive, that the government is particularly responsive to, then using that as an entry point is a potentially really good avenue. For example, I mentioned Thailand again, but so Thailand has highlighted or stressed the importance of using a bottom-up, citizen-driven approach to implement and define the SDGs. Now, there are a lot of roadblocks to citizen engagement in Thailand. It's not, but using the SDGs as a way to, at least around maybe poverty eradication or some of the rural targets, that might be a way where you can get an entree into working with supporting SDGs. And again, Indonesia is an example where they had stuck. There's some of the access information work. They had the laws, but they didn't have the implementation, especially at the subnational level. The SDGs provided an impetus for them to focus on that and to highlight that and to support better implementation of access to information. And so, and the same is true was true for citizen participation fora that direct the development plans. And so, I mean, there's no magic bullet, but to the extent that if broadly you don't see the government moving forward the SDGs, if there are specific areas where you have a good relationship with the government or that you know the government is responsive to, there should be enough in the SDGs that you can use that as an entree and say, this is to kind of open the door for further expansion and further pressure to use the SDGs more broadly.
In that context then, just very generally, I think a question Jimmy has here, he's no mic, is just about how do you actually move the SDGs from being that sort of high-level policy to actually having impact on the ground, to actually impact on people's lives? What are the prospects of that, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that happens. I mean, that's something that honestly I think we face sometimes in open government too. It's not just open government for open government's sake. It's open government for what? And the extent to which that you can be specific, you can take the goals and you can take the targets and you can link them to, again, the national action plans for the open government partnership or to other strategies or priorities of the government. I think the SDGs, my sense is that they're probably most valuable when they're used to highlight or build on cases or build on priorities that are already under discussion, or already underway. And I think it provides an international and comprehensive approach. But by focusing on how the SDGs can link to other priorities that you're already working on or that already mentioned other places, I think that would be the way to do that, to use them as a leveraging and magnifying approach.
Great. Well, I think we're probably out of questions, and you've fielded enough questions there, Craig, so I think I might bring the session to a close. I'd just like to thank you again for your contribution. It's very much appreciated, and I think there was a lot of useful content there for us to get our teeth into. We will be making the webinar, or the audio from the webinar, available on the UK Open Government website, as well as the UK Open Government Forum, where we can continue the discussion there on the forum. And if you would like to join the network, you can do so. We're going to email around the links to both the website and the forum where you can join the network. So at this point, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in, and I hope you'll be able to join us at our next webinar, which we hope to run around the end of June. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.